Good morning. Thanks for coming. I've been asked to do a couple of quick things before we start. Firstly, to encourage people to move into the middle of the rows to allow people in, although we're not so full that I guess that makes a huge difference. And because this is early, please remember to have your phones on silent so they don't ring in the thing and distract me terribly. Cool. Let's get on with the show. So, hi. My name is Matt Woodward. I'm a game designer at CCP Games. I work on EVE Online. I've been here for about 7 years. I dabble in a lot of things, but I mainly do systems design. Time I've been in CCP, we've shipped 12 expansions for EVE, which would have been 13, but I spent 6 months last year in Shanghai working on Dust 514, which is our free-to-play console shooter on the PS3. Prior to arriving at CCP, I did a philosophy degree at Cambridge University, which, as you can imagine, was incredibly useful. What I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to give an introduction to EVE Online. I'm going to try and explain it as simply as I can so people can understand how it works as it relates to this presentation without getting into the nitty-gritty too much, because it would take a while. I'm going to do that so I can give you a brief history of Crimewatch, which is our policing system, how it relates to how the game works. I'm going to explain why Crimewatch 1.x, i.e. all the versions between the initial release and when we decided to rip it out and start over, were problematic. I am going to explain the design fundamentals behind our rework. I'm going to go over some practical issues that arose as we were developing it, and I'm going to give a quick overview of what happened next, including some lovely graphs. So, introduction to EVE Online. Do we have anyone in the audience who's like a serious EVE player? Okay, a few of you. Okay, I apologize to you guys. Can you bear with me? For the benefit of the rest of the audience, I'm going to be simplifying a lot of things in this presentation. EVE has a huge complexity problem. If I try to explain the full detail and implications of everything, this would take about 5 hours. So I'm going to tell you what you need to know to understand this, but we're not going to get into the details. I'm going to simplify a few things that aren't really relevant. EVE Online. EVE Online is kind of like, who here has played World of Warcraft and knows what World of Warcraft is at least? Okay, cool. Most of you good. So EVE is, like World of Warcraft, is an MMO. It's a massively multiplayer online game. It basically means we have a big shared persistent virtual world. In most other respects, we're completely different. The two big things that differentiate us from most other MMOs, most other games like World of Warcraft or EverQuest or whatever. Firstly, we are single-sharded. Most MMOs shard. They have run multiple copies of the same game world, multiple instances of the world space in parallel. So you connect to a particular shard, and that is a copy of the game world, and your friends in different shards will have a different world they're playing in. EVE is single-sharded. Everyone connects to the same server cluster. Everyone connects to the same world instance. So when we have 60,000 people online, they're all in the same space, and they could all, in principle, go to the same location in space and crash the server if they really wanted to. The other thing that distinguishes us a lot from most other MMOs is that we are much more sandboxy, much more emergent than the sort of the industry standard. Most MMOs work on a sort of, the primary thrust of the game is content consumption. You do missions, you level up, you get stronger, you do more missions or quests, whatever you want to call them, until you get to the end, and then you do raids. EVE is pretty freeform. We put you in a sandbox, like a big open world. We give you a bunch of tools, a bunch of rules to play with, and we let you figure out for yourself what you want to do and how you want to do it. So we're more hands-off and more kind of freeform. The thing that I like to say a lot is that EVE is a game about people disguised as a game about spaceships. We dress everything up in science fiction. We have lasers and spaceships and explosions and lovely things, but really, first and foremost, it's a game about people and people interacting with one another. You're in a big shared world with a bunch of other players. You've got competing or aligned goals, and you're trying to work out how you want to get to where you can get to without other players messing you up too much. One of our sort of main design philosophies at CCP is that players are the most interesting content. It's much more interesting to interact with other players than it is to interact with something the designer has thought up. People are just more endlessly variable, more interesting naturally. So pretty much all features in EVE follow at least one of the following two goals. Firstly, they reward cooperation. We'd rather you play with others than play on your own. And secondly, they provoke conflict. We'd rather get the challenge from you interacting with other players, so we want players to be working across purposes. The best features in EVE have both, so they encourage players to team up and then work against other teams in various ways, both direct and indirect. Because this is a big social game, it's all about people, it's all about interactions, a lot of the high-level gameplay ends up being less about the game mechanics and more about politics and about culture and about power and how those things interact with one another and what you can get away with. For this kind of gameplay to be meaningful, we also find it necessary to make it about choice and about consequence. We give you choices, we let you know clearly what the consequences are. We try to make sure that the choices are interesting, and then when you make a choice, we make you live with it. Prime example of this in EVE is death. Death in EVE can be pretty painful. If your ship blows up, your ship has blown up and it is gone. It is space dust. And anything that you're carrying or anything that was fitted to your ship is sitting in your wreck, and anyone can steal it if they happen to fly past. We make the game quite consequence-heavy. We like the actions to have major impact and not just be like, oh, I died, I guess I'll go back and get my stuff and start over. Like, dying can be painful, and gameplay is structured around trying to mitigate that. Another form of consequence in EVE that is very relevant to this presentation and leads me into something I need to explain anyway is where you want to live. So we have 5,500 solar systems in EVE. Each solar system has a security status, which is like its permanent like signifier of how dangerous it is at least supposed to be. These range from 0.0 at the bottom to 1.0 at the top. So you can choose to live in high security space, which is we call high sec, between 0.5 and 1.0. This area space is pretty safe. It's heavily policed by NPCs. You do something bad, you get blown up. It's also controlled by the NPC empires. They own it. They set most of the rules. We don't give you a whole lot of flexibility as a player because of that. So consequences of choosing to live in high sec. It's very safe. It's very stable. It tends to be, as a result, very low margin because mainly you're competing on price with other players when you're competing, certainly from a market point of view, and it is a very good place to do market stuff, to do commerce, to do industry, to get a nice, stable, reliable income. By contrast, you can choose to live in null security space with a security rating of 0.0. This area of space is completely unpoliced mechanically. There's no policing, there's no enforcement out here, except what the players manage to do themselves. It's completely controlled by the players. The NPC empires have no say and no control. So choosing to live out here puts you in constant danger. Anybody you see can kill you without consequence. Because this area of space promotes conflict, and because we're a social game, it also promotes grouping up a lot. This area of space is very much aligned with our goals, so we put the rarest and therefore the most valuable resources out here, so there's a lot of money to be made. And most of the infrastructure is also built by players. You can build stations and starbases and various infrastructure upgrades that act as force multipliers, both in the traditional military sense of letting your military fleet be stronger than it otherwise would be, and also in an economic sense, you can make more money because you've invested in infrastructure to make the space more valuable. This infrastructure can be attacked and destroyed and or stolen by other players, so the owners of the infrastructure have a big advantage, but if someone else can take it away, that advantage flops over very hard to the attackers. This means that it's a very kind of winner-takes-all space. If you believe that you are a winner, this is a good place for you. Luckily for us, most of our players believe they're above average, so we get a lot of players in this area of space. And then there's low sec, which we don't often talk about because we have this nice high sec, null sec dichotomy, and it's very clean and very simple. I'll go this way. No, I'll go this way. Low sec. Low sec is low security space with a rating between 0.1 and 0.4. And low sec is kind of fuzzy. Low sec is the borderlands between the two. It's semi-policed, but not really strongly policed. It's semi-controlled by the NPC empires, but not entirely. As a consequence, the profits are pitched kind of between the two. The safety level is kind of pitched between the two. The major differentiator from low-sec is that it's much more uncertain than any other area of space. In null-sec, you see another player. They're either your friend, and they're probably not going to kill you, or they're not your friend, and they are going to kill you, and you should shoot them first. In high-sec, you can be pretty sure most people leave you alone. In low-sec, you see another player. You don't really want to shoot him first, because you might get penalized for doing so, but he might shoot you. What do you do? Oh, my God. It's a much more fuzzy area in terms of who is and isn't dangerous. It's also very opaque. We don't give a whole lot of information. There's not a lot of traffic moving through low-sec. As a consequence of these two things, it is a good area for small fights, which in EVE means kind of 5 to 50 a side. It's also a very good place for doing things you don't want other players to know about. A lot of things that happen in low-sec happen because it's away from prying eyes. I'm talking about low-sec in this presentation because it is very relevant to Crimewatch, our policing feature, because in high-sec, pretty much you can't shoot other people except in specific situations. In null-sec, it doesn't matter because Crimewatch doesn't work there, because there's no policing at all. In low-sec, this is the area where changes to how policing work have the biggest impact on the game, because it's the place where the most gameplay revolves around dancing around the edges of what is and isn't legal. So, that is basically EVE Online. Let's talk about Crimewatch. Let's talk about how we got to where we got. As I said, Crimewatch, I'm saying 1.x to mean everything between 1.0 and 2.0, which was our reboot of the whole thing. In the beginning, there was nothing. There was no Crimewatch. Then players were dicks to each other, so we created Concord. This is our NPC police force. The kind of original hope was that we can make EVE self-policing. It's kind of the hope of every sandbox MMO developer, that the players will police themselves. We quickly discovered that it works to a degree because players will try to self-police, but it's not consistent. You can't rely on it because the guy who's the local sheriff just might not be online today, and then you're screwed. So we created this NPC police force, Concord. You shoot someone in high security space without permission, Concord rocks up and they blow you up. You may be able to kill the other guy first, but Concord is pretty much always going to kill you. Crimewatch is a system that runs Concord. Concord are just big buff NPCs. They splat you in the face, nice and straightforward. So that kind of worked until we had this thing called the Uli incident. So Uli was a big trade hub in EVE. In 2004 or so this is. It's a 1.0 security system, so it should be the safest space in the game. No one should be able to shoot each other without Concord killing them here. A thing you need to know about EVE here is because we promote cooperation, we balance the game to that end, healing other players is really powerful. So you can set your ship up to heal your own ship, which does say, 500 hit points of damage a second repaired. You can set your ship up to heal another ship, which might do like 650 a second. So it's already more numerically powerful, and because multiple people can repair the same target, you can start stacking repairing quite a long way, and you can probably see where this is going. These players realized that with enough battleships, they could sit on a Stargate, which is a choke point into the system. They could just shoot everyone that comes through, and they could heal the guy being shot by Concord for more damage than Concord could do. So they sat on this Stargate for about 8 hours, killing everything that jumped in, made people very upset until we encouraged them to move along with some dev commands. This was a problem. This is the thing we did not want to do. We had a desired game balance. High sec should feel safe. They had found a way to break that because we had made an assumption about how much damage we needed to do to kill them, and the players had found a way to violate that assumption. This is going to be a recurring theme. The way we solved this was that we put ramping damage on Concord, so the DPS increases exponentially over time. After about 30 seconds, it's doing effectively infinite damage. There's no real way to tank that effectively. So, Crimewatch handled Concord in the beginning. Then we decided that we wanted to have some form of reputation, so we created security status for players. EVE is a very complex game. We have security status for systems, which is a number between 0.0 and 1.0, which is a permanent stat for that system. We now also have a security status for players, which is a number between 10 and minus 10 and can change over time. Woo! So we created this system. We wanted to use this as a reputation tracking system. So if you get down to minus 10, you're a very bad person. Other players can see that you might be trouble. And it's related to Concord and to doing bad things, and we build it into the Crimewatch system. That made perfect sense. Criminal flag, when we wanted to add some element of player policing back in, just with Concord, it means that if someone shoots you in high security space, they're going to get killed by Concord in about 20 seconds, but if you shoot them back, Concord will kill you too because you're attacking them illegally, so we create criminal flags. You do something bad, you get a criminal flag, other players can now shoot you without penalty. And that's to do with security status and doing bad things in Concord, so we build this into Crimewatch, and we leverage the same design space, and we leverage the same code base. We continued down this path for a while. I'm not going to try and explain all of these. This is just an illustration that there were an awful lot of systems that tied into both the same design concepts, the same underlying systems, and also the same code base. This was crimewatch.py, which was many lines of code. And stuff broke. Stuff started to break over time. As we followed this path of adding more and more into this big monolithic system, things started to break, and not just in the kind of predictable way that you touch bounties and bounties break, but we had, for example, a issue where Jamie, who's been my partner in crime for a lot of this, Jamie Bannister, lovely guy, fixed a bug to do with kill mails. Kill mails are a mail we send out when you kill somebody saying, well done, you killed this guy, he did 1,000 points of damage and he dropped some really shiny loot. There was an issue with damage calculation in certain edge cases. We weren't showing the right numbers, so we fixed a bug with that, and NPC kill bounties stopped working. You kill an NPC, you get some money. That's a primary form of income for a large number of players. We fixed a bug with kill mails, and the bounties broke because they were using the same code path. This was not a good thing, and as this went on over time, we got to a point where this just wasn't sustainable. Every time we touched anything to do with Crimewatch, we would have to exploit test the entire code base to make sure we'd not introduce something horrendous. So in mid-2011, we introduced an unofficial ban on further development internally. It just wasn't worth the risk. Unfortunately, because Crimewatch is spidered into so many things, this meant that huge areas of the code base were effectively off limits, which is not a sustainable position. So, at the end of 2011, we created a new Scrum team called Team 5.0 with the mandate of fixing this problem. We crossed our fingers and we walked forwards. So, the first thing we did with this, our team, we sat down, we tried to identify what had gone wrong and why, and how we'd got into such a fragile situation. We found a lot of little problems, but in particular we found 2.5 major systemic design issues that were the root of most of our issues, which I'm going to explain now. First one, complexity breeds complexity. We had a system that was very simple at the beginning, but we added complexity to it too fast. It snowballed pretty quickly. It became very complex. In particular, it became complex because we had special cased an awful lot of things. Because we were kind of bootstrapping ourselves in the early days, we had added a lot of features by just leveraging existing features and existing code and existing system behavior where possible, and then special casing the bits that weren't already covered in a very ad hoc, very kind of bespoke manner. This led to an awful lot of special case code covering particular cases for new features. We also had exploits in the early days. When we have an exploit and something horrendous breaks, we need to fix it in the quickest, cheapest, least risky way possible, which tends to be a special case, tends to be a band-aid fix that we can ship the same day and shut things down, which meant that, again, we had an awful lot of band-aiding and special casing in the system. This approach doesn't work over the long term. If you have a dense, complex system with lots of special cases, and you find problems in that system and you try to fix them with more special cases, you end up creating more problems. It's kind of analogous to the Roman Empire's solution to border problems. Push back your borders. You solve the immediate issue, but you just have now a longer border. So yeah, adding complexity to a complex system, trying to close loopholes with special case fixes takes you to very bad places. It ends up being self-defeating. If you want another real-world example of this, look at the tax law. We also know how that works or doesn't work. So yeah. That's one big problem we had. The system had become overly complex. We couldn't manage it, and we were trying to solve it constantly by making small targeted fixes, which were just adding to the complexity and causing us more issues. Second big issue, leveraging intuitive fairness. We have a policing system. It needs to feel fair, or players are very upset when they get punished. We were trying to make it feel fair by relying on what people felt should be fair in that situation, which seems intuitively like it should work. We have a weapon in Eve called the Smart Bomb. I don't know if you can read the text. It doesn't really matter. It's just a nice picture. We have a weapon in Eve called the Smart Bomb, which is a very badly named weapon for two reasons. Firstly, because the weapon itself is not smart. There is no logic involved. It's very indiscriminate. It's also badly named because using it is not smart. It is a very clunky and unfocused weapon. And it gives us particular problems immediately in this kind of system where we're trying to rely on intuition to get fairness. If you play MMOs, you will know this as a PB AoE damage effect, probably. If you don't play MMOs, you will know it as you press a button and your ship goes boom and damages everything around it. And in the context of a intuitively based policing system, does it seem intuitively fair that if you damage another player with it, you should be punished for doing so? In the case where you're flying around behind somebody, constantly blasting their ship and doing them lots of damage and deliberately trying to kill them, it seems pretty obvious that you need to be punished, because otherwise it's a huge glaring loophole in our punishment systems. In the case where you're sitting off in deep space, running a mission, killing NPC pirates with your smart bomb completely legitimately, and somebody flies up to your ship cloaked and takes damage from you, and you can't even see them, for you to be punished for that to happen seems grossly unfair to most people. Obviously, these two situations are, from a basic mechanical point of view, basically the same. You are activating a smart bomb and damaging a player, but our intuitions on what is and isn't fair as a result depends a lot on the context and on the intent of the player. And this is not just an isolated case with the smart bomb. This is actually a general case issue in ethics, and I'm going to use my degree here. We have this issue in ethics called the trolley problem. This is the very basic form of it. You have this trolley, which is a tram, I guess, for British people. Is going to run over these 5 guys. Do you flip the switch and make it kill the one guy instead? Most people can eventually work their way through this and figure out a solution they're happy with. Not everyone agrees, but it comes down a lot to action versus inaction and how utilitarian you are, essentially. The basic problem is pretty straightforward, but then you start embellishing on it and you add people dying of cancer and being pushed off bridges and something to do with roller skates. I don't totally remember, wasn't paying attention in class. But the end result that I do remember is you get to a place where you can demonstrate pretty comprehensively with this kind of framework and this field of study that people's intuitions about what is and isn't fair, what is and isn't ethical, are hugely complex, hugely variable, and often hugely inconsistent with themselves, internally inconsistent. If you try, therefore, to create a system that seems fair by leveraging what people feel is fair intuitively based on the situation, you're going to need to create an incredibly complex system, see previous problem, and you're probably not going to manage to capture it entirely because some things are just not accessible to you from the point of view of the server. You can't tell what a player is thinking easily with server code. That's the second big problem. And then a subset of this, which I think is a big enough hole and an easy enough hole to fall into to be worth the discussion on its own, is aggression graphs. Aggression graphs are an abomination before God. This is what happens when you try to handle assistance in a fair way. Assistance, I mean helping out another player in a way that's likely to influence the outcome of the fight. As I said earlier, healing other players in EVE is really powerful. So dealing with how you penalize people for healing criminals becomes quite a big issue. Here is the problem that you can fall into very easily. We have 3 rules. First, we need a self-defense rule. If someone shoots you, you should be able to shoot them back without penalty. That seems pretty fair. Otherwise, you're just sitting there waiting to die. Assistance rule. So, if someone shoots me, I can shoot them back because of self-defense. If someone heals that person, I should be able to shoot the person healing them too, because otherwise, probably they're going to swing the fight in their favor. Healers are pretty squishy. I want to kill him first. This seems fair to most people. And thirdly, the minimal scope rule. We don't want to involve the whole universe in small disputes. We want to make it so that just the people involved in the altercation can shoot each other, and we don't flag you to everybody in the game. These 2 things together take you to a very bad place. Here's an aggression graph. Red lines are people shooting, green lines are people healing, and the triangles are ships. This is 16 people. This is nice and small. Let's explain why this is a problem. Start with 2 ships, A and B. A shoots B. Red line means attacking. This is very bad. He gets a penalty for it. B can now attack A, which is what the orange arrow means. Because of self-defense rule, I've been attacked. I can attack back. C turns up, sees A's buddy, heals A, green line. B can now shoot C because of the assistance rule. And he does. And now C can shoot B because of the self-defense rule. At this point, the system is complex enough that we have enough rope to hang ourselves. We're just going to pay it out now. D turns up and heals C. B can now shoot C because of because of the assistance rule. E turns up. B finally gets a friend, lucky guy, and gets healed. C can heal E because of the assistance rule. E can probably see this coming. It's not that difficult to set the UI up so that so E can understand that when he starts healing, he's going to get attacked, or at least potentially attacked by C. But now B shoots D, which he's totally allowed to do, and that means that now, because of assistance and self-defense, D can shoot B, but D can also shoot E. And how you telegraph this to E, and how you make that seem fair to him, that because B did something, someone else can now shoot him, is already somewhat problematic and hard to do and leads to some interesting problems. That's 5 people, take it up to 16 people, back to where we were at the start, and it looks like this. This is a small fight, as I said, in EVE. Low sec, 50 versus 50 is on the large side. In null sec, the biggest fight we had was a couple of months ago, which was 2,000 aside. You can imagine the graph for that. It looks very unpretty. It does not scale particularly well. Here's an even better factor. Here's a second fight that turns up. I've just copied them because I'm lazy. But see Z in the middle on the right, sees his buddy B in the middle on the left, and he says, oh God, B's in trouble. I should heal him. And now P can shoot 6. Woo! How does 6 know that this is happening? How does 6 feel this is fair? How does the server calculate, oh my God, what just happened? This starts to get very messy very quickly. If you multiply this by 100, you can see that the problem is quite large. Let's look at a specific case that the players discovered last year, or a couple of years ago. We have this high-end PvE feature called incursions, which are basically raids in simple EVE terms. This is 20 people. They're fighting some very strong NPCs who are switching targets. There's a lot of damage, like washing around the fleet, essentially. Players discover that, or they set up this thing called a circle rep. They're repairing in a circle. Everyone's repairing to other ships. Everyone's getting heals from 2 other ships. Makes them very robust. Who's this guy? Oh dear, he's going to accomplice in the fleet. B shoots A, very bad man. A can now shoot B because of self-defense. Because of the assistance rule, A can now shoot anybody who's healing the people he's shooting. Because of the assistance rule, A can now shoot anyone who's healing the people he can shoot. Because of the assistance rule, A can now shoot the entire fleet. And cleans up quite nicely. Aggression graphs are a bad thing. It may be possible to make it fair with a lot of work, with a lot of complexity. Pretty sure it's not worth the effort. So yeah, aggression graphs, just say no. Those are kind of the 3 underlying issues we had with the old system. So we sat down to try and figure out the new one. We laid out some design goals, and we started working through some solutions. So design goals we had. First one, which I'm not going to talk about too much, was make the UI not be bad. Suffice to say, in the old system, we would sometimes throw up a timer on your screen saying, criminal countdown, 15 minutes. We didn't tell you why you'd got that timer. We did not tell you what that timer meant. And a lot of the time, or at least some of the time, the timer could get out of sync, so it would run out on the client, but the server would think you had 3 minutes left. Solving this was a big goal, but this is not a particularly relevant goal to this talk. I just wanted to touch on it because it was crazy. Second big goal, maintain the current balance as much as possible. We were going to rip out the systems, rip out the functionality, change how everything worked. We did not want to change the game balance of the system too much at the same time. It seemed like too much risk to us. There's no specific thing we worked on for this, but I will mention it later because it's relevant to some other issues that will come up. Third goal, simple and understandable. I think the thing I wrote in the design doc originally was we want to be able to explain this to players in less than half an hour, which is very conservative, but also a huge advantage over the old system, which you basically couldn't explain because some of the things the player needed to know to understand it were just not available on the client at all. We had our outsourced testing partners do some exploratory testing over Christmas 2011 to try and document how the system worked from a player's perspective. They wrote us a 42-page PDF, which turned out to have missed a bunch of edge cases. It was an extremely complex system. EVE as a whole is a very complex game. It has a complexity problem we need to deal with. We need to bring the complexity of all our features down generally. And Crimewatch is a supporting feature. It is not usually primary gameplay. It is a feature that makes the gameplay of other features slightly better. So we do not want players to have to struggle understanding this system that is not giving them a whole lot of immediate value. So we had a very strong goal to get the complexity of this system under control. Other big goal was to have it not break. The old system broke an awful lot. We've been given the green light to redesign this system in no small part because the old system was broken. We wanted to make sure this didn't happen again. That would be a rather large waste of time and make us very sad. Obviously, this benefits a lot from just having a simpler system, but there are also specific things we did, which I will get back to in a minute. First, I'm going to talk about simplicity. Which sounds very obvious and very easy. Everyone knows that, simple design is better. Certainly we at CCP hugely aware that simple design is better, but we keep making complex systems anyway. It's easy to say, make it simple. We found it harder to actually execute on. A particular fact of this that we discovered doing this is that pretty much every problem you run across in design has the simplest solution available is very straightforward, or at least the easiest solution available, Very straightforward, but adds a little bit of complexity. In each individual case, the complexity you're adding to your system is not that much, but when you solve every problem you have by adding a bit of complexity, by adding a bit of special casing, you find that mounts up very quickly over time, and that's how you sleepwalk into very complex systems. So we wanted to spend some time at the beginning of the project investing in simplicity, investing in figuring out all the things the system needs to do, and then find the simplest, most generic system that would solve as many of our problems as possible at once. A thing we kind of found along the way is to do with, again, special casing. Ideally, you want no special casing. You want a completely generic system with a single set of rules that applies in all cases. That would be lovely if it could work. In practice, you often can't manage that. A single level of special cases works okay. It's not ideal, but as long as you have generic rules, list of exceptions to those rules, you're probably going to work out just about all right. As soon as you start making special cases for your special cases and exceptions for your exceptions, you are going down a rabbit hole that you will never get out of. You're going to find your exceptions all the way down. The point where you say, we have this special case, but we need to special case it, that is the point where you should really step back and say, we need to solve this in the base system because we are never going to solve this by adding more exceptions to it. Our big starting point for this was no aggression graphs because we hate them. They cause us an awful lot of issues. And in particular, we want to get rid of all one-to-one flagging. We do not have any cases where I can just shoot you. Instead, we went for a system of global flags. We picked 2 flags, suspect flag and criminal flag. You get one of these, everybody can shoot you. You do something slightly worse, you get the criminal version, which means that Concord will attack you as well in a high-security space. Otherwise, they're pretty much the same. We deal with aggression by if you heal someone with or assist someone with a flag. We deal with assistance by saying if you assist someone with a flag, you get the flag too, and we stop tracking that relationship after that. This is a pretty simple system. It's not actually, in terms of the rule set, that much simpler than the aggression graph system, but because we are not tracking relationships, the sort of the state space, I guess, of the system is significantly smaller because we no longer care about every single combination. It's just what flag does each individual have, so it scales a lot better. It's much easier for players to understand what is going on and predict the consequence of their actions. And kind of in working through this, came across a particular realization that there were 2 concepts that we really needed to split out to understand, to think about correctly what we were doing. The first of these is balance. Balance is about quality of outcomes. Balance is about saying we want high security space to feel safe. That's a balanced goal. We want to make sure that we tune the system so that the penalties we're giving for attacking each other in high sec disincentivize players from doing that enough that it's the exception rather than the norm. Other thing we want is fairness. Fairness is about predictability. Fairness is about doing something and knowing what the consequences are and being happy with those consequences and being able to correctly predict what they will be. And it's very easy to conflate these 2 things and use the word fairness when you're talking about balance and vice versa. And this leads to a huge amount of complexity because you're trying to solve 2 separate issues at the same time and makes just life a lot harder. And how this relates to specifically the changes in Crimewatch 2, we realized that the old system, as I said earlier, was relying on an intuitive sense of what's fair. Instead, we realized if we separate these 2 things out and we leave the balance to later, we can make a fair system first, and a fair system is about predictability. And a really good way to get predictability is to have the system so simple that you can understand it from the get-go. So the new system, because we're doing all global flags, for example, people feel that's a little bit, it doesn't conform with their intuitions. They think, I should just be shot by that guy. So it's not as conformant with people's intuitions about fairness, but it is nonetheless fair because they can say, okay, it feels like this should happen, but I know the system works because it's really simple. I understand everything about it, and I know what the consequences are. I know they violate my intuition, but I can still predict them. I do not need that intuition to predict them. Therefore, we can stop relying on intuition. We can throw out that big, complex model of how people think and just say, here is a really simple system, follow the rules. So that's kind of how we get into simplicity and stuff. Other side, not breakingness. There's 2 parts to not breakingness. First is just being reasonably confident that when you finish working on the system, it is not broken already. This is not a new problem or particularly isolated to this. Implementing software that is not broken, I'm not going to try and solve that here. I don't think I need to. Simple product, design it carefully, implement it carefully, test the shit out of it. You will probably be okay. The bit that we found more problematic is making sure that it will not break in the future. Having something that will continue to last and continue to work for a long time. Obviously, for us as a live game, we have a strong interest in our stuff not breaking in 5 years' time. It's been running for 11 years already, nearly, and we're expecting to run at least another couple of decades. So we do not want to create a system that will break next year. It's a huge waste for us. I think it's also, though, so it's very relevant if you're any kind of live games as a service model. I think it's also probably very useful if you're working on a more traditional game where you finish it and you ship it and you're more or less done with it except for DLC or whatever, in that to the degree that your designs are changing during development, being able to be confident that your design will not break in future means that if your design changes, you can be fairly confident that previous things that were done in a robust way are not going to break because of design changes or implementation changes. So I think this is a generally useful concept. The key we have found here is to avoid, wherever possible, making unenforced assumptions. There's 2 ways into this. Firstly is build systems with as few assumptions as possible. Eliminate all the assumptions you can from your code base and from your design space. For example, I talked earlier about the ULI issue. Players had figured out they could do more damage, or they could heal more damage than Concord was doing because we made an assumption. We got rid of that assumption by saying the damage scales exponentially over time, so we did not need to care about how much damage you can repair a second. As long as it's not infinite, you're still going to get popped eventually. A more subtle way of doing this, or more subtle instance of this happening in EVE, is ship insurance. You can buy insurance for your ship. which will pay out a certain percentage of the ship's value when it inevitably gets blown up. It's not a very good insurance business, but it's a game mechanic, so we gloss over that. Originally, these insurance payouts were all hard-coded. We'd taken at the beginning of the game, we think a battleship is worth about this much. This is how much this battleship pays out. Over time, because mineral prices fluctuated, because we have a free market and players chose to mine different things, the values of the ships that were actually selling for on the market diverged from the insurance prices, because we were making assumptions about how much they were worth that were being broken over time. So instead, we put in a system which uses a very heavily managed, to avoid exploits, market average of the price for each ship. So rather than us having to make an assumption about ships are worth this much, this ship is worth this much, we just say how much are they actually selling for, how much is an actual replacement going to cost you, and then key the insurance values off that. So yeah, avoiding assumptions as much as possible will really help you out with things not breaking. You can't make a completely assumptionless system generally, so where you are making assumptions, I strongly recommend enforcing them explicitly. Simple example, if you want to make the assumption that player health cannot go over 1,000 hit points, a non-robust, break-prone way of doing that is saying, well, no current combination of items and abilities that we can think of can make it over 1,000. So that's fine. We'll just make a bunch of balance decisions based on that, and we'll code the UI so it can't go over 1,000. Inevitably, in the future, you'll add something, or players will find something, or something will happen, and they can get 1,050, and all kinds of horrendous things happen. If you want to make that assumption that hit points can't go over 1,000, don't just rely on the idea that it can't probably happen now. Enforce it in code. Just cap it. Just say if this number goes over 1,000, we will take it down to 1,000. We will lock that in. So if you're going to make the assumption, the more you can ensure that it cannot be broken by players, the more confident you can be it's not going to break in future. Example of this in Crimewatch 2, we have this safety system we added. We wanted to make the assumption, because it solved a lot of problems for us, that players were always and only getting criminal and suspect flags when they did something deliberately bad. So we create this safety switch, which is on by default. You cannot do bad things while this is on. If you have it engaged in the green setting, and you're, say, in an incursion and you're healing someone and they get aggression and you're about to get aggression like the circle rep exploit earlier, the server goes, hey, if you keep healing this guy, you'll get a suspect flag, but your safety is on, so I'm going to turn your modules off so you cannot do that. We enforce that on both the client and the server. Means that you cannot fall into that, so we get the one assumption we can get out of it, as I say, is there's no, the entire class of exploits where you can get another player flagged without them realizing it, getting killed, and they petition customer support, and it creates a lot of load for us, is gone. Because so long as their safeties are on, they cannot get that flag. There is no way to trick people into getting aggression flagged without meaning it, because the system just enforces that you can't do it. So we can make a nice, clear assumption that that class of exploit is out of the game. It also means on the flip side that if you do want to do something bad, you first need to turn your safeties off, which we are logging on the server, and we're very aware of. So we can take that, use that to assume that you intend to do something bad. So when you then get a criminal flag and you get punished for it, we can make the assumption that was deliberate. In the past, we'd always been worried that new players were going to shoot each other by accident and get penalized and be very upset and leave the game, which would make it sad, so it kind of tempered the penalties we handed out. With this system, they have to jump through, like, as you can see, 3 hoops. You've got to click a thing, and then click a thing, and then click confirm, and there's a red text and a pop-up. And we're pretty confident that players are aware of what they're doing at this point. If they have managed to get the safety off, then if they do something bad subsequently, we just assume that they did it deliberately and we move on. So yeah, don't make assumptions where you can't help it. If you're going to make them, enforce them. Hopefully this takes you to a place where we can talk about being bomb-proof, which means that we can have a very high confidence this is not going to break in the future. Because we're not making unenforced assumptions, we're pretty confident the design cannot go out of bounds. It has to conform to the assumptions that we're making, because the few that we are making are being enforced. And the system is simple enough that we can then evaluate essentially the possibility space, the state space the design can get into, and we can be pretty confident that all the elements of the design work in a way that we're happy with. If we get these 2 things together, we can be pretty confident that things will work nicely. Some practical issues, because we can be pretty confident in theory, and it's a lovely idea in theory, but in practice we have release dates and we have customers, so things do not always go according to plan. First, I'm going to talk about 2 issues we came to, balance issues we ran across in the pursuit of simplicity. The first was that we previously, when you did something bad, would give you one of 2 separate security status penalties. One for aggression, and a second one if you killed someone without them having fought back. This allowed us to have some nice nuance in what we were penalizing for what. In the new system, we wanted to simplify things. We wanted to simplify this. We wanted to give a single penalty when you do something bad, so you attack someone without mission, you get a criminal flag, and you get a security status penalty at the same time. Which means we can't know if the fight ends up being fair or unfair. We have to give a single hit out rather than 2 hits, which means that the value we have to pick ends up being somewhere between the two ideal values of those 2 separate cases, a compromise that really suits neither. We could obviously have just added some complexity back in here, retain the balance. Instead, we choose to harm our balance slightly in order to keep the system simple. This is the kind of decisions that you have to make if you want to keep your simplicity under control. If we had a lot more time, we might have found a better solution, but we didn't, so we did this and we moved on. On the flip side, we also changed how sentry guns work. Sentry guns sit around stargates in low-sec, and they shoot people who are bad. And the old system was a very complex set of rules that discouraged a lot of smaller ships in particular because they'd kill them before they could do anything. We simplified this behavior as well. We just made it so if it sees, again, we're tying everything to this act of doing something bad, you get a flag, you get the security status penalty, and the sentry guns start shooting you when they see that happen. And if you go away, they stop shooting you and leave you alone. This allowed a lot more interesting gameplay around stargates. It means small ships could get involved. It meant that you didn't have to go and sit in the space for 15 minutes waiting for your timers to wear off before you could come back in, which the drive for simplicity here pushed us to change the game balance in a way that was incredibly well received by players. They were really happy about this. It made fighting in low security space a lot more interesting. So between these 2 things, insisting on simplicity got us some ups and it got us some downs. That's just like a quick sampling of the kind of the issues that you run into while doing these things. The other thing I guess I should talk about is corporation wars. We have in EVE the permanent unit of player social unit is a corporation. It's analogous to a guild in other games. You join a corporation, it's a semi-permanent social group. Corporations can declare war on each other, which allows them to fight without consequence and without anyone else getting involved, even in high security space. This is a very old feature. It's a very well-loved feature. It's a very entrenched feature in the minds of our player base. We could not really change this. We did not want to change the balance of it too much. And supporting it requires some form of one-to-one flagging, which made us very sad. Because obviously we wanted to get away from that, from the aggression graphs and all that stuff, but we worked in that direction for a long time, saying no, 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 and eventually we went, yeah. So we introduced a third kind of flag called a limited engagement, which is a very generic system. It's not particularly tied to wars. It allows 2 players or 2 groups of players to fight each other without interference. We solved a lot of things with this. It allowed us to solve some long-standing problems with corporate wars and third parties healing into the war and being untouchable because they're not part of the war. We just gave them a suspect flag for doing so. It allowed us to do dueling, which we'd wanted to do for many years, but hadn't had the time to get it in. When you have this system already, dueling is just a UI that says, do you want a limited engagement with this guy, yes or no? And it allowed us to solve the self-defense problem in a much better way than we had been doing previously. If you're following this very closely, you'll have spotted that's a huge loophole in the global flag system. This allowed us to deal with that in a much better way. So we had a nice generic system. This was we have our flags, which is the underlying generic thing. We have this nice generic special case, limited engagement, which handles a whole bunch of issues. So we have 1 level of special casing. We're pretty confident this works. We haven't found any issues with it yet. I'm fairly happy with it, but it's the least happy bit of the design. I'm least happy with because it's that horrible exception that we wanted to avoid. So, what happened? Everything pretty much worked, which made us very happy. Since release, we released this in, winter 2012, the end of the redesign. We had, after the first month, where we had a few code issues to do with edge cases we'd missed, we have had 0 design defects, 0 exploits, and we've had 1 code defect to do with auto-targeting missiles about 3 months ago. Other than that, we took a system which was horrendously breakage-prone, horrendously complex, players couldn't understand, and horrendously prone to exploits. We've shipped a feature that for the last year has run with basically no defects. This made us very happy. It made us very confident in the process we followed. Cool. Let's look at some graphs. I've got 3 graphs for you today. This is jumps in low sec. So Retribution is the name of the expansion we shipped in winter 2012. Jumps we take as a pretty good proxy for activity because most activity in EVE involves flying around between systems, which means jumping between systems through stargates. And we can see there's a nice uptick in jumps in low sec in particular, which, as I said, is the area space most affected by these changes, in terms of the gameplay balance at least. That goes up after we ship this, so good. We're seeing more activity. It makes us happy. Characters receiving security status penalties per week. The red line is for high security space, which, as you can see, is settling slightly higher, which we are not totally happy with. This is the consequence of that change to the penalties we were giving out I was talking about earlier. We couldn't find a good balance because we wanted to simplify it to a single penalty, which means that the kind of behavior we see most often in high-sec, which is very one-sided ganks, went down slightly, so the incidence of it has gone up slightly. We'd prefer if this hadn't happened, but this is a consequence we're happy to live with. On the other hand, see it go up a lot in low-sec, which can be a good thing and can be a bad thing. We like consensual fights in particular, where both sides want to have a fight. Those make us really happy because fighting in EVE is really fun. We're less keen on ones where it's really one-sided. We can't tell just from this graph which this is, but if we added the next graph, PvP kills, i.e. players shooting each other in low-sec per week, we see a nice big spike in retribution. So not only are more people fighting each other, but as we can see, between these two graphs, the two blue lines, the ratio of kills that involve a security status penalty has effectively gone down. So more fights are happening because both sides want it. So we're both getting more combat and more desired combat at the same time, which is great. So, summary time. Adding to a complex system, trying to fix a complex system by adding more complex to it is going to kick your ass. It's a bad approach. Try and avoid it wherever you can. Try not to rely on an intuitive sense of fairness when you're making policing systems. If you try to capture what people think is fair, or like intuitive fair out of a situation based on its context and based on the intentions of the people involved, it will lead to a very complex system which you'll probably still fail to actually capture what people think should be happening. Do not use aggression graphs. They are bad. Do stay simple as much as you possibly can. Obviously, this is generic design advice, but I'm just going to reinforce it. Simple makes you easy to understand. Simple makes you less breakable. Simple makes you easier to predict. Do enforce whatever few assumptions you are making. Make as few assumptions as you can and enforce them wherever you can. This will result in a system which is much less likely to break over time. Sometimes life is not perfect. Sometimes you have to bite the bullet. Try to at least keep to a single level of exceptions, but while I'm advocating wherever possible doing things the nice, clean, easy way, in reality, sometimes that is not possible. That is everything I have to talk about today. Thank you for coming. Please fill out your feedback forms, and I think we probably have time for questions. Thank you. Hi.
Hello. At the start of the talk, you talked about some of the smart bombs and how you could be cloaked and then trigger security status that way, or you could, there's this problem of like someone following someone around and using smart bombs. How does that fit into the system? Like, how are those two cases handled?
So, yes, you caught one of the awkward bits. The way we dealt with smart bombs in the system is we just said that you need to turn your safeties off in order to use them, because honestly, there's no good way of dealing with a completely indiscriminate damage effect otherwise. So your safeties must be off. If you hit someone, you take the flag. That's the end of it. It's kind of harsh, but it makes the weapon less usable. But at least players can understand very clearly that the smart bomb is telling you you can't use it because it's dangerous to use. I can hopefully intuit the consequences of that from that.
Hi, you said that you like the consensual fights more than the one-sided fights. And one example of the non-consensual ones is where you have a corporation in high-sec. It's really peaceful. They just want to mine. And then war gets declared on them by this PvP corporation that wants easy targets. Do you see that as a problem?
We see that as a less desirable case than the case where the two corps actually actively want to fight. That is, and so going back to the distinction between fair and balance, that's a balance concern that we have, that we need to look at some more, but we don't have any solid changes to that. For this, as I said earlier, we wanted to keep the balance as close as possible to the old system, so we were aware this was going to happen. We didn't want to change it because it significantly increased the risk of the work we were doing, so we were changing the mechanics and trying to keep the balance constant, essentially.
Thank you.
So there were clearly some positive responses from changing that system and simplifying it. But as far as the community response was concerned, what people were actually saying, how did that evolve and change?
Community response to this set of changes?
Yes.
It varied depending on which bit of the community you asked. Most people, I think, were reasonably happy. There was some outcry when they first saw the safety system and people thought we were implementing a PvP switch, so people can't shoot you if it's on. And once we cleared that up, they were okay with that. Low-sec people really liked the sentry gun changes. That was, it was almost a side effect from our point of view, but it ended up being hugely popular. We got a lot of praise for that. There were some people in high sec. There was an example I ended up cutting from the presentation. So you can steal from people's loot in space, and from like you kill an NPC. Normally it's your loot, but other people can steal from it. And there's a small group of players, very dedicated players, who built a profession out of can flipping, i.e. taking from their can, getting the guy to shoot them, and then going back in the bigger ship and killing them back. We essentially killed that with the global flagging. Previously, the trick was to flag yourself to one player and then get them killed. With the global flags, you can't do that anymore. They're very upset about that. We had some back and forth on this. We weren't sure exactly how we felt. We liked that it was emergent gameplay. We didn't like that it was mainly targeted at new players. But at the end of the day, we weren't prepared to sacrifice the simplicity to solve it. So we said we're just essentially throwing this profession that you made up out. They were pretty angry for a while. It's a consequence of the simplicity. They're smart people. I'm pretty sure they found some other way to scam people pretty quickly. But yeah, overall, it was pretty well received. We were simplifying a lot of things, making a lot of things clear, making the UI better, solving a lot of outstanding player complaints. The changes to people healing into wars was a big win, because people were really fed up of declaring war and having one guy flying armed with 20 healer ships following him they couldn't shoot. So, I mean, it was a year ago. I don't totally remember, but I'm pretty sure most of it went down pretty positively. It's a supporting system, not a primary gameplay system. So long as we kept the balance the same, a simpler, more easy to understand system goes down pretty well.
I was just curious because, I mean, some could make the argument that there is a substantial segment of your player base that may be interested in exploiting. Right, and moving around the rules is a form of gameplay that's very interesting. When you drastically shift that, then that changes what they perceive as fair and what they enjoy. Yeah,
and I think, we eliminated certain kinds of exploits, which made them kind of sad, but for the players that enjoy that kind of gameplay, they're generally smart enough, and our system as a whole is complex enough that there are other things they can go and do instead. So they were sad that we'd taken away some of their favorite loopholes, but I don't think that many of them quit, because there are plenty of other loopholes still to be closed.
Thanks.
No worries. Nobody else? Okay, cool. Well, yeah, thanks for coming. Do your feedback things. Have a lovely day. Thank you.